It wasn't such a bad gash, and though he was sent to Crowface to have it seen to, he was back almost straight away with a square of dressing plastered to his elbow. No one thought much about it until a couple of days later, when Tommy took off the dressing to reveal something at just that stage between sealing and still being an open wound. You could see bits of skin starting to bond and soft red bits peeping up from underneath. We were in the middle of lunch, so everyone crowded round to go, ugh. Then Christopher from the year above said with a dead straight face, "Pity it's on that bit of the elbow. Just about anywhere else it wouldn't matter." Tommy looked worried. Christopher being someone he looked up to in those days, and he asked what he meant. Christopher went on eating and then said nonchalantly, "Don't you know? If it's right on the elbow like that, it can unzip. All you have to do is bend your arm quickly. Not just that actual bit, the whole elbow. It can all unzip like a bag opening up. Thought you'd know that." I could hear Tommy complaining that Crowface hadn't warned him of anything of that sort, but Christopher shrugged and said, "She thought you knew, of course. Everyone knows." A number of people nearby murmured agreement. "You've got to keep your arm dead straight," someone else said. "Bending it at all's really dangerous." The next day, I could see Tommy going about with his arm held out very rigidly and looking worried. Everybody was laughing at him, and I was cross about that, but I had to admit there was a funny side to it. Then toward the end of the afternoon, as we were leaving the art room, he came up to me in a corridor and said, "Kath, can I just have a quick word?" This was maybe a couple weeks after the time I'd gone up to him in the playing field to remind him about his polo shirt. So it had got about we were special friends of some sort. All the same, his coming up like that asking for a private talk was pretty embarrassing and threw me way off balance. Maybe that partly explains why I wasn't more helpful than I was. "I'm not too worried or anything," he began once he got me aside. "But I wanted to play it safe, that's all. We should never take chances with our health. I need someone to help, Kath." He explained, concerned about what he might do in his sleep. He might easily bend his elbow in the night. "I have these dreams all the time where I'm fighting loads of Roman soldiers." When I quizzed him a bit, it became obvious all kinds of people who hadn't been there at lunchtime, had been coming up to repeat Christopher's warning. In fact, it seemed a few had carried the joke further. Tommy had been told of a student who'd gone to sleep with a cut on the elbow just like his, and woken up to find his whole upper arm and hand skeletally exposed, the skin flopping about next to him like one of those long gloves in My Fair Lady. What Tommy was asking me now was to help tie a splint on the arm to keep it rigid during the night. "I don't trust any of the others," he said, holding up a thick ruler he wanted to use. "They might deliberately do it so it comes undone in the night." He was looking at me in complete innocence, and I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted badly to tell him what was going on, and I suppose I knew that to do anything else would be to betray the trust we built up since the moment I'd reminded him about his polo shirt. And for me to strap up his arm in a splint would have meant my becoming one of the main perpetrators of the joke. I still feel ashamed I didn't tell him then, but you've got to remember I was still young and I only had a few seconds to decide. And when someone's asking you to do something in such a pleading way, everything goes against saying no. I suppose the main thing was that I didn't want to upset him, because I could see, for all his anxiety about his elbow, Tommy was touched by all the concern he believed had been shown him. Of course, I knew he'd find out the truth sooner or later, but at that moment I just couldn't tell him. The best I could do was ask, "Did Crowface tell you you had to do this?" "No," he said, "but imagine how angry she'd be if my elbow slipped out." I still felt bad about it, but I promised to strap his arm for him in room 14 half hour before the night bell, and I watched him go off grateful and reassured. As it happened, I didn't have to go through with it because Tommy found out first. It was around 8 in the evening. I was coming down the main staircase and heard a burst of laughter rising up the stairwell from the ground floor. My heart sank because I knew immediately it was to do with Tommy. I paused on the first floor landing and looked over the rail just as Tommy came out of the billiards room with thunderous footsteps. I remember thinking, at least he's not shouting, and he didn't. The whole time he went to the cloakroom, got his things, and left the main house. And all that time, laughter kept coming from the open doorway of the billiards room, and voices yelling things like, "If you lose your temper, your elbow will definitely pop out." I thought about following him out into the evening and catching up with him before he got to his dorm, but then I remembered how I promised to put his arm in a splint, and I didn't move. I just kept saying to myself, at least he didn't have a tantrum. At least he kept hold of that temper. But I've gone off a bit. The reason I was talking about all this was because the idea of things unzipping carried over from Tommy's elbow to become a running joke among us about the donations. The idea was that when the time came, you'd be able just to unzip a bit of yourself, a kidney or something would slide out, and you'd hand it over. It wasn't something we found so funny in itself. It was more a way of putting each other off our food. You unzipped your liver, say, and dumped it on someone's plate, that sort of thing. I remember once Gary, who had this unbelievable appetite, coming back with a third helping of pudding, and virtually the whole table unzipping bits of themselves and piling it all over Gary's bowl, while he went on determinedly stuffing himself. Tommy never liked it much when the unzipping stuff came up again, but by then the days of his being teased were past, and no one connected the joke with him anymore. It was just done to get a laugh, to put someone off their dinner, and I suppose as some way of acknowledging what was in front of us. And this was my original point. By that time in our lives, we no longer shrank from the subject of donations as we'd had a year or two earlier, but neither did we think about it very seriously or discuss it. All that business about unzipping, that was typical of the way the whole subject impinged on us when we were 13. So I'd say Miss Lucy had it about right when she said a couple years later that we'd been told and not told. And what's more, now I think about it, I'd say what Miss Lucy said to us that afternoon led to a real shift in our attitudes. It was after that day, jokes about donations faded away, and we started to think properly about things. If anything, the donations went back to being a subject to be avoided, but not in the way it had been when we were younger. This time round, it wasn't awkward or embarrassing anymore, just somber and serious. "It's funny," Tommy said to me when we were remembering it all again a few years later. None of us stopped to think about how she felt, Miss Lucy herself. We never worried if she'd gotten into trouble, saying what she did to us. We were just so selfish back then. "But you can't blame us," I said. "We've been taught to think about each other, but never about the guardians. The idea that guardians had differences between them, that never occurred to us." Tommy said, "But we were old enough. By that age, it should have occurred to us. But it didn't. We didn't think about poor Miss Lucy at all. Not even after that time, when you saw her." I knew straight away what he meant. He was talking about the morning early in our last summer at Hailsham, when I'd stumbled across her in room 22. Thinking about it now, I'd say Tommy had a point. After that moment, it should have been clear, even to us, how troubled Miss Lucy had become. But, as he said, we never considered anything from her viewpoint, and it never occurred to us to say or do anything to support her. Many of us had turned 16 by then. It was a morning of brilliant sunshine, and we'd all just come down to the courtyard after a lesson in the main house. I remembered something I'd left in the classroom, so I went back up to the third floor, and that's how the thing with Miss Lucy happened. In those days, I had this secret game. When I found myself alone, I'd stop and look for a view, out of a window or through a doorway, any view so long as there were no people in it. I did this so I could, for a few seconds at least, create the illusion the place wasn't crawling with students, but that instead Hailsham was this quiet, tranquil house where I lived with just 5 or 6 others. To make this work, you had to get yourself into a sort of a dream and shut off all the stray noises and voices. Usually you had to be pretty patient too. If, say, you were focusing from a window on one particular bit of the playing field, you could wait ages for those couple of seconds when there wasn't anyone at all in your frame. Anyway, that's what I was doing that morning after I'd fetched whatever it was I left in the classroom and come back out on the third floor landing. I was keeping very still near a window, looking down onto a section of the courtyard where I'd been standing only moments before. My friends had gone and the courtyard was steadily emptying, so I was waiting for my trick to work when I heard behind me what sounded like gas or steam escaping in short bursts. It was a hissing noise that would go on for about 10 seconds, pause, then come again. I wasn't alarmed exactly, but since I seemed to be the only person around, I thought I'd better go and investigate. I went across the landing toward the sound, along the corridor past the room I'd just been in, and down to room 22, second from the end. The door was partly open, and just as I came up on it, the hissing started up again with a new intensity. I don't know what I expected to discover as I cautiously pushed the door, but I was properly surprised to find Miss Lucy. Room 22 was hardly used for classes because it was so small, and even on a day like that one, hardly any light got in. The guardians sometimes went in there to mark our work or get on with reading. That morning, the room was darker than ever because the blinds had been pulled almost all the way down. There were 2 tables pushed together for a group to sit around, but Miss Lucy was there alone near the back. I could see several loose sheets of dark, shiny paper scattered over the table in front of her. She herself was leaning over in concentration, forehead very low, arms up on the surface, scrawling furious lines over a page with a pencil. Underneath the heavy black lines, I could see neat blue handwriting. As I watched, she went on scrubbing the pencil point over the paper, almost in the way we did shading in art, except her movements were much more angry, as if she didn't mind gouging right through the sheet. Then I realized in the same instant that this was the source of the odd noise, and that what I'd taken for dark, shiny paper on the table had also, not long before, been pages of neat handwriting. She was so lost in what she was doing, it took a while for her to realize I was there. When she looked up with a start, I could see her face was flushed, but there were no trace of tears. She stared at me, then put down her pencil. "Hello, young lady," she said, then took a deep breath. "What can I do for you?" I think I turned away so I didn't have to look at her or at the papers over the desk. I can't remember if I said very much, if I explained about the noise and how I'd worried about it being gas. In any case, there was no proper conversation. She didn't want me there, and neither did I. I think I made some apology and went out, half expecting her to call me back. But she didn't, and what I remember now is that I went down the staircase burning with shame and resentment. At that moment, I wished more than anything that I hadn't seen what I'd just seen. Though, if you'd asked me to define just why I was so upset about it, I wouldn't have been able to explain. Shame, as I say, had a lot to do with it, and also fury, though not exactly at Miss Lucy herself. I was very confused, and that's probably why I didn't say anything about it to my friends until much later. After that morning, I became convinced something else, perhaps something awful, lay around the corner to do with Miss Lucy, and I kept my eyes and ears open for it. But the days passed and I heard nothing. What I didn't know at the time was that something pretty significant had happened only a few days after I'd seen her in room 22. Something between Miss Lucy and Tommy that had left him upset and disoriented. There would have been a time not so much earlier when Tommy and I would have immediately reported to each other any news of this sort, but just around that summer, various things were going on which meant we weren't talking so freely. That's why I didn't hear about it for so long. Afterwards, I could have kicked myself for not guessing, for not seeking Tommy out and getting it out of him. But as I've said, there was a lot going on around then, between Tommy and Ruth, a whole host of other stuff, and I'd put all the changes I'd noticed in him down to that. It's probably going too far to say Tommy's whole act fell apart that summer, but there were times when I got seriously worried he was turning back into the awkward and changeable figure from 7 years before. Once, for instance, a few of us were going back from the pavilion toward the dorm huts and found ourselves walking behind Tommy and a couple of other boys. They were just a few paces ahead, and all of them, Tommy included, looked to be in good form, laughing and shoving each other, In fact, I'd say Laura, who was walking beside me, took her cue from the way the boys were larking about. The thing was, Tommy must have been sitting on the ground earlier because there was a sizable chunk of mud stuck on his rugby shirt near the small of his back. He was obviously unaware of it, and I don't think his friends had seen it either, or they'd surely have made something of it. Anyway, Laura, being Laura, shouted out something like, "Tommy, you got poo-poo on your back. What have you been doing?" She'd done this in a completely friendly way, and if some of the rest of us made a few noises too, it wasn't anything more than the sort of thing students did the whole time. So it was a complete shock when Tommy came to a dead halt, wheeled round, and stared at Laura with a face like thunder. We all stopped too, the boys looking as bewildered as we were, and for a few seconds I thought Tommy was going to blow for the first time in years. But then he abruptly stalked off, leaving us all swapping looks and shrugging. Nearly as bad was the time I showed him Patricia's calendar. Patricia was 2 years below us, but everyone was in awe of her drawing skills, and her stuff was always sought after at the art exchanges. I'd been particularly pleased with the calendar, which I'd managed to get at the last exchange because word had been going round about it for weeks before. It wasn't anything like, say, Miss Emily's flappy color calendars of the English counties. Patricia's calendar was tiny and dumpy, and for each month there was a stunning little pencil sketch of a scene from Hailsham life. I wish I still had it now, especially since in some of the pictures, like the ones for June and September, you can make out the faces of particular students and guardians. It's one of the things I lost when I left the cottages, when my mind was elsewhere and I wasn't being so careful with what I took with me. But I'll come to all that in its place. My point now is that Patricia's calendar was a real catch. I was proud of it, and that's why I wanted to show it to Tommy. I'd spotted him standing in the late afternoon sunshine beside the big sycamore near the south playing field, and since my calendar was there in my bag, I'd been showing it off during our music lesson, I'd gone over to him. He was absorbed in a football match involving some younger boys over in the next field, and at this stage his mood seemed just fine, tranquil even. He smiled when I came up to him, and we chatted for a minute about nothing in particular. Then I said, "Tommy, look what I managed to get." I didn't try to keep the triumph out of my voice, and I may even have gone ta-da as I brought it out and handed it to him. When he took the calendar, there was still a smile on his features, but as he flicked through, I could see something closing off inside him. "That's Patricia," I began to say, but I could hear my own voice changing. "She's so clever." But Tommy was already handing it back to me. Then, without another word, he marched past me off toward the main house. This last incident should have given me a clue. If I'd thought about it with half a brain, I should have guessed Tommy's recent moods had something to do with Miss Lucy and his old problems about being creative. But with everything else going on just at that time, I didn't, as I say, think in these terms at all. I suppose I must have assumed those old problems had been left behind with our early teen years, and that the only big issues that now loomed so large could possibly preoccupy any of us. So, what had been going on? Well, for a start, Ruth and Tommy had had a serious bust-up. They'd been a couple for about 6 months by then. At least that's how long they'd been public about it, walking around with arms around each other, that kind of thing. They were respected as a couple because they weren't show-offs. Some others, Sylvia and Roger for example, could get stomach churning, and you had to give them a chorus of vomiting noises just to keep them in order. But Ruth and Tommy never did anything gross in front of people, and if sometimes they cuddled or whatever, it felt like they were genuinely doing it for each other, not for an audience. Looking back now, I can see we were pretty confused about this whole area around sex. That's hardly surprising, I suppose, given we were barely 16. But what added to the confusion, and I can see it now more clearly, was the fact that the guardians were themselves confused. On the one hand, we had, say, Miss Emily's talks, when she'd tell us how important it was not to be ashamed of our bodies, to respect our physical needs, how sex was a very beautiful gift as long as both people really wanted it. But when it came down to it, the guardians made it more or less impossible for any of us actually to do much without breaking rules. We couldn't visit the boys' dorms after 9 o'clock. They couldn't visit ours. The classrooms were all officially out of bounds in the evenings, as were the areas behind the sheds and the pavilion. And you didn't want to do it in the fields even when it was warm, because you'd almost certainly discover afterwards you'd had an audience watching from the house passing around binoculars. In other words, for all the talk of sex being beautiful, we had the distinct impression we'd be in trouble if the guardians caught us at it. I say this, but the only real case I personally know of like that was when Jenny and Rob got interrupted in room 14. They were doing it after lunch right there over one of the desks, and Mr. Jack had come in to get something. According to Jenny, Mr. Jack had turned red and gone right out again, but they'd been put off and had stopped. They'd more or less dressed themselves when Mr. Jack came back, just as though for the first time, and pretended to be surprised and shocked. "It's very clear to me what you've been doing, and it's not appropriate," he said, and told them both to go see Miss Emily. But once they got to Miss Emily's office, she told them she was on her way to an important meeting and didn't have time to talk to you. She said, "But you know you shouldn't have been doing whatever you were doing, and I don't expect you'll do it again," she said before rushing out with her folders. Gay sex, incidentally, was something we were even more confused about. For some reason, we called it umbrella sex. If you fancied someone your own sex, you were an umbrella. I don't know how it was where you were, but at Hailsham, we definitely weren't at all kind toward any signs of gay stuff. The boys especially could do the cruelest things. According to Ruth, this was because quite a few of them had done things with each other when they'd been younger, before they realized what they were doing. So now they were ridiculously tense about it. I don't know if she was right, but for sure, accusing someone of getting all umbrella could easily end up in a fight. When we discussed all these things, as we did endlessly back then, we couldn't decide whether or not the guardians wanted us to have sex or not. Some people thought they did, but that we kept trying to do it at all the wrong times. Hannah had the theory that it was their duty to make us have sex because otherwise we wouldn't be good donors later on. According to her, things like your kidney and pancreas don't work properly unless you kept having sex. Someone else said what we had to remember was that the guardians were normals. That's why they were so odd about it. For them, sex was for when you wanted babies. And even though they knew intellectually that we couldn't have babies, they still felt uneasy about us doing it because deep down they couldn't quite believe we wouldn't end up with babies. Annette had another theory, that the guardians were uncomfortable about us having sex with each other because they'd then want to have sex with us. Mr. Chris in particular, she said, looked at us girls in that way. Laura said that what Annette really meant was that she wanted to have sex with Mr. Chris. We all cracked up at this because the idea of having sex with Mr. Chris seemed absurd as well as completely sick-making. The theory I think came closest was the one put forward by Ruth. "They're telling us about sex for after we leave Hailsham," she said. "They want us to do it properly with someone we like and without getting diseases. But they really mean it for after we leave. They don't want us doing it here because it's too much of a hassle for them." My guess, anyway, is that there wasn't nearly as much sex going on as people made out. A lot of snogging and touching up, maybe, and couples hinting they were having proper sex. But looking back, I wonder how much of it there really was. If everyone who claimed to be doing it really had been, then that's all you'd have seen when you walked about Hailsham, couples going at it left, right, and center. What I remember is that there was this discreet agreement among all of us not to quiz each other too much about our claims. If, say, Hannah rolled her eyes when you were discussing another girl and murmured, "virgin," meaning, of course we're not, but she is, so what can you expect? Then it definitely wasn't on to ask her, "Who did you do it with? When? Where?" No, you just nodded knowingly. It was like there was some parallel universe we were all vanished off to where we had all this sex. I must have seen at the time how all these claims being made around me didn't add up. All the same, as that summer approached, I began to feel more and more the odd one out. In a way, sex had got like being creative had been a few years earlier. It felt like if you hadn't done it yet, you ought to, and quickly. And in my case, The whole thing was made more complicated by the fact that two of the girls I was closest to definitely had done it. Laura with Rob, even though they'd never been a proper couple, and Ruth with Tommy. For all that, I've been holding it off for ages, repeating to myself Miss Emily's advice. If you can't find someone with whom you truly wish to share this experience, then don't. But around the spring of the year I'm talking about now, I started to think I wouldn't mind having sex with a boy. Not just to see what it was like, but also because it occurred to me I needed to get familiar with sex, and it would be just as well to practice first with a boy I didn't care about too much. Then later on, if I was with someone special, I'd have more chance of doing everything right. What I mean is, if Miss Emily was correct and sex was this really big deal between people, then I didn't want to be doing it for the first time when it was really important how well it went. So I had my eye on Harry. I chose him for a number of reasons. First, I knew he'd definitely done it before with Sharon. Next, I didn't fancy him that much, but I certainly didn't find him sick-making. Also, he was quiet and decent, so unlikely to go around gossiping afterwards if it was a complete disaster. And he'd hinted a few times he'd like to have sex with me. Okay, a lot of the boys were making flirty noises in those days, but it was clear by then what was a real proposition and what was the usual boy stuff. So I'd chosen Harry, and I only delayed those couple months because I wanted to make sure I'd be all right physically. Miss Emily had told us it could be painful and a big failure if you didn't get wet enough, and this was my one real worry. I wasn't being ripped apart down there, which we often joked about. It wasn't being ripped apart down there, which we often joked about, and was the secret fear of quite a few girls. I kept thinking as long as I got wet quick enough, there'd be no problem, and I did it a lot on my own just to make sure. I realized this might sound like I was getting obsessive, but I remember I also spent a lot of time rereading passages from books where people had sex, going over the lines again and again, trying to tease out clues. The trouble was, the books we had at Hailsham weren't at all helpful. We had a lot of 19th century stuff by Thomas Hardy and people like that, which was more or less useless. Some modern books by people like Edna O'Brien and Margaret Drabble had some sex in them, but it wasn't ever very clear what was happening because the authors always assumed you'd already had a lot of sex before and there was no need to go into details. So I was having a frustrating time with the books and the videos weren't much better. We'd got a video player in the billiard room a couple years earlier, and by that spring had built up quite a good collection of movies. A lot of them had sex in them, but most scenes would just end as the sex was starting up, or else you'd only see their faces and their backs. And when there was a useful scene, it was difficult to see it more than fleetingly because there were usually 20 others in the room watching with you. We'd evolved this system where we called for particular favorite scenes to be played again. Like, for instance, the moment the American jumps over the barbed wire on his bike in The Great Escape. There'd be a chant of rewind, rewind, until someone got their remote and we'd see the portion again, sometimes 3 or 4 times. But I could hardly, by myself, start shouting for rewinds just to see sex scenes again. So I kept delaying week by week while I went on preparing, until the summer came and I decided I was ready as I'd ever be. By then, I was even feeling reasonably confident about it, and began dropping hints to Harry. Everything was going fine and according to plan when Ruth and Tommy split up and it got all confused. What happened was that a few days after they split, I was in the art room with some other girls working on a still life. I remember it being stifling that day, even though we had the fan rattling behind us. We were using charcoal, and because someone had commandeered all the easels, we were having to work with our boards propped up on our laps. I was sitting beside Cynthia, and we'd just been chatting and complaining about the heat. Then somehow we'd gotten onto the subject of boys, and she said, not looking up from her work, "And Tommy, I knew it wouldn't last with Ruth. Well, I suppose you're the natural successor." She'd said it in a throwaway manner, but Cynthia was a perceptive person, and the fact that she wasn't part of our group just gave her remark more weight. What I mean is, I couldn't help thinking she represented what anyone with any distance on the subject would think. After all, I'd been Tommy's friends for years until all this couple stuff had come up, It was perfectly possible that to someone on the outside, I'd look like Ruth's natural successor. I just let it go, though, and Cynthia, who wasn't trying to make any big point, said nothing else about it. Then maybe a day or two later, I was coming out of the pavilion with Hannah when she suddenly nudged me and nodded toward a group of boys over on the north playing field. "Look," she said quietly, "Tommy, sitting by himself." I shrugged as though to say, so what, and that's all there was to it. But afterwards, I found myself thinking a lot about it. Maybe all Hannah had meant to do was point out how Tommy, since splitting with Ruth, looked a bit of a spare part. But I couldn't quite buy this. I knew Hannah too well. The way she nudged me and lowered her voice had made it all too obvious she too was expressing some assumption, probably doing the rounds about me being the natural successor. All this did, as I say, put me in a bit of confusion because until then I'd been all set on my Harry plan. In fact, looking back now, I'm sure I would have had sex with Harry if it hadn't been for this natural successor business. I'd had it all sorted and my preparations had gone well. And I still think Harry was a good choice for that stage of my life. I think he would have been considerate and gentle and have understood what I was wanting from him. I saw Harry fleetingly a couple years ago at the recovery center in Wiltshire. He was being brought in after a donation. I wasn't in the best of moods because my own donor had just completed the night before. No one was blaming me for that. It had been a particularly untidy operation, but I wasn't feeling great all the same. I'd been up most of the night sorting all the arrangements, and I was in the front reception getting ready to leave when I saw Harry coming in. He was in a wheelchair because he was so weak, I found out later, not because he couldn't actually walk, and I'm not sure he recognized me when I went up and said hello. I suppose there's no reason I should have any special place in his memory. We never had much to do with each other apart from that one time. To him, if he remembered me at all, I'd just be this daft girl who came up to him once, asked if he wanted to have sex, then backed off. He must have been pretty mature for his age because he didn't get annoyed or go around telling people I was a tease or any of that. So when I saw him being brought in that day, I felt grateful to him and wished I was his carer. I looked about, but whoever was his carer wasn't even around. The orderlies were impatient to get him to his room, so I didn't talk to him long. I just said hello, that I hoped he'd feel better soon, and he smiled tiredly. When I mentioned Hailsham, he did a thumbs up, but I could tell he didn't recognize me. Maybe later when he wasn't so tired or when the medication wasn't so strong, he'd have tried to place me and remembered. Anyway, I was talking about back then, about how after Tommy and Ruth split, all my plans got confused. Looking at it now, I feel a bit sorry for Harry. After all the hints I'd been dropping the previous week, there I was, suddenly whispering stuff to put him off. I suppose I must have assumed he was raring to go, that I had my work cut out just to hold him off, because whenever I saw him, I'd always get something in quick, then rush off before he could say anything back. It was only much later when I thought about it, it occurred to me he may not have had sex on his mind at all. For all I know, he might have been happy to forget the whole thing, except that every time he saw me along a corridor or in the grounds, I'd come up and whisper some excuse why I didn't want to have sex with him just then. It must have looked pretty daft from his side, and if he hadn't been such a decent type, I'd have been a laughingstock in no time. Well, anyway, this era of putting Harry off lasted maybe a couple of weeks. Then came Ruth's request.